Okay, just yeah. So basically, the children should come and then they should know what. Oh, sorry, I just want to start when.
Looking at.
Oh, sorry. So you are starting your talk?
No, yeah, no. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me to give you a talk on some of the research that I and my colleagues have been doing over the last few years. Of course, you can't work on this scale, and at scale I mean the whole of the Himalaya Tibetan region on your own. You have to work as part of a team, and the team I've been working with are mostly based at Sichuanbana Tropical Botanical Garden in China, southern China, and also at Bristol University, where there is an excellent climate modeling team. And together we are funded under the name of Umbrella, Understanding Monsoons and Biodiversity Relevant to Landscapes and Livelihoods in Asia. So this is a collective piece of work, and I am just representing my colleagues. So what I'm going to do now is to give you a quick overview of what the talk is about. It's very usual to hear the phrase, the uplift of the Tibetan plateau. And this annoys me because basically this phrase is just nonsense. Tibet did not rise as a single low relief, that is to say, flat entity. A plateau does not rise as a single unit. It is formed over time in complex ways. Sometimes we'll hear the term QTP, Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. And this is often used not just for the Tibetan Plateau itself, but to include the Himalaya. This, as you will see, is also nonsense. We are going to examine the structure and assembly of what I prefer to call the third pole region, and the various ideas how it sort of came to be Earth's highest, largest, and youngest topographic feature, a feature that impacts the entire global climate, but of course has major influences on the Asian monsoon system. We're going to look at isotope data, and we're going to look at fossils and the way that they've been used to quantify the topography and climate of this third pole region. And then we're going to examine just how reliable these paleoaltimeters are. And to do that, we're using a particular location, the Zanda or Zada Basin in the Western Himalaya. So first of all, let's consider some of the growth models that have been proposed for the formation of this third pole region. Back in the 1980s, geophysicists wanted to try and understand the crustal dynamics involved because this is such an unusual feature on Earth. And so being physicists, they wanted to reduce everything down to the basic, most simplest forms of equations. And they decided to treat the region as plastic. And by compressing India coming from the south and Eurasia offering some resistance to the north, by compressing the crust and mantle lithosphere, the mantle lithosphere in particular becomes thickened, or they both become thickened. And as the mantle lithosphere projects down into the hot asthenosphere, it eventually gets thermally eroded away or melts away or drops away. This releases some load on the relatively heavy and dense mantle lithosphere. So the whole thing springs back up like a cork would if you cut a weight that was holding it down in water. And it was proposed that this process occurred around 10 million years ago and led to the sudden rise of the Tibetan Plateau from an elevation of around 3,000 meters to its current average close to 5,000 meters. The geologists protested at this and said, no, you can't do that because you're ignoring all the deep structures that we know exist within the region. So Toponier et al. In 2001 proposed a model whereby India comes in from the south, compresses Eurasia, and we get progressive building of the highland region, starting in the Eocene in the south part of the plateau, progressing to the northeast. So the youngest uplift is occurring up here. What Taponnier et al. Didn't say much about were the Himalaya, but by implication, the Himalaya were also formed very early on in the Eocene or even before, according to this model. In the early 2000s, there was quite a lot of work done using stable isotopes, oxygen isotopes really. And what the results seem to suggest that areas along here in the Gangdesi, the old mountain range that we now know existed before the Himalaya, that they found high elevations in the Paleogene. And that following on from the Taponnier model, Moulton Chamberlain, in a commentary in Nature on the isotope work by Rowley and Curry, suggested a progressive uplift, much as Taponnier had done, but put some numbers on it using isotope paleoaltimetry. More recently, in 2014, Wang Chenshan and colleagues proposed that actually central Tibet was very high in the Eocene. And they did that because subsequent to this work, there was some isotope data coming in from central Tibet that also suggested very high elevations. So in this model, we have a proto-Tibetan plateau that expands both northwards and southwards, primarily in the Neogene. So this core proto-Tibetan plateau was already there in the Paleogene. Well, let's go back and actually look at the area that we're talking about. And here we can see the topography shown in different color shadings. And I've added the northern boundary to the plateau region, the Altingtau Fault, the Karakoram Fault to the west, the Himalaya to the south, and the Hengduan Mountains that slope down into Yunnan. But you can see from this that actually there are some quite strong east-west structures represented by lowlands running through this plateau. It's not entirely flat. And these are ghosts of what we now know to be junctions between different tectonic terrains that impacted from Gondwana and impacted Eurasia all through the Mesozoic. So we start up here with the Chaidam Basin and the terrain that sits on, and this terrain here coming in first in the Triassic. Then the terrain that we're going to be talking about most that now is represented by the Tangula uplands, the Changtang terrain. This arrives in the Jurassic. This is followed by the Lhasa terrain, along the southern margin of which are the Gangdesi Mountains. And this collides with the Changtang terrain in the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. And then lastly, of course, we have India coming in and creating the Himalaya against the pre-existing Gangdesi. So this is what the area looks like when broken down into its different terrain components. And a cross section here was drawn by Kapp and Descelles in 2019, and they hypothesized about what was going on deep below the crust. We have the Indian plate subducting and diving down here. We have the Asian plate coming down here. And the Lhasa terrain is showing as being subducted below the Changtang terrain. So the Lhasa terrain is going down underneath the Changtang terrain. Well, every time you get a collision like this, you get the formation of fallen basins. And the fallen basin today, just along the front of the Himalaya, is the Gangetic Plain. And every one of these collisions previously will have created a lowland in front of a mountain belt as subduction takes place. And of course, what the edifice does today is it deflects airflow. So we have westerlies being deflected around the Himalaya Tibetan third pole region. But being high, it warms and creates a summer low, which draws air in from off the oceans towards it, which gives us our monsoon rains, our South Asia monsoon and our East Asia monsoon. And the East Asian monsoon is able to penetrate inland and northwards far more than it would normally have done, because the westerlies are blocked by the third pole obstruction. So there's obviously been a lot of interest in how this third pole came to be. And I've briefly given you an overview of my description of the collision of the various terrains. But now I want to go and look at this new model, which has been proposed literally within the last 5 years or so, and in particular, quantified in the last 5 years or so using paleoaltimetry. So here we have the Gangdesi, which, as I said, existed way back in the Cretaceous, largely by virtue of the fact that we are starting to get subduction of the Tethyan plate, oceanic plate below Eurasia as India starts its journey north. In the mid-Cretaceous, north of the Gangdesi, we have the remnant of the Mesotethys Ocean. So we have marine sediments here being deposited until around 100, 110 million years ago. And to the north of that, we have the Tangula uplands, which are created by the collision of the Lhasa and Changtang terrains. So here we are, this is the Cretaceous. By the time we get to the Middle Eocene, this marine deposition has long ceased, and we have quantified the surface as being at around 1.5 to 1.7 kilometers, let's say 45 million years ago. The Himalaya at this point are not much more than a small bump, around maybe 1 kilometer high on the southern flank of the Gangdesi. By mid-Miocene, the area which is now the core of the Tibetan Plateau has risen to close to its present elevation. It's somewhere between 4 and 5 kilometers at this point in time. Also at this time, the Himalaya have risen to match the height of the Gangdesi. So here they are, they're around 4,500 to 5,000 meters at this point in time, but that isn't high enough to stop monsoonal air rising up and going over this barrier and keeping the core of Tibet still relatively moist. So it's covered in a warm temperate woodland at this point. And of course, the modern situation is that the Himalaya continue to rise well above the Gangdesi, which effectively blocks the monsoon. So we have a dry Tibetan interior at around 4,500 to 5,000 kilometers. So this is a very different kind of model to the one proposed by England and Houseman, the geophysics model, or Taponier or Wang Chengshan et al., where we have a proto-Tibetan plateau high in here in the Middle Eocene. This is all very well, but how do we know this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some work that we've been doing in just a few of the plant fossil localities that we've been studying over the last few years. We're going to focus on the Lumpula and Bangor basins here that lie along the Bangong-Nujiang suture, this junction between the Lhasa terrain and the Changtang terrain. These basins have accumulated a lot of sediments, in fact, up to 4 kilometers of sediments in what used to be the Foreland Basin when the Lhasa terrain subducted beneath the Changtang terrain. And these 4 kilometers of sediments span the Paleocene all the way through to the present, but mostly they represent Eocene and Oligocene sediment accumulations. In order to understand elevation, we also need to compare what we find here with sea level localities. And the localities we're going to use are a selection along the Siwaliks, which today are representative of what was going on in the Miocene, predominantly the Miocene, but also Pliocene in close to sea level. We're assuming that these were deposited either at sea level or no more than 200 meters above sea level. So how do we go about measuring altitudes in the past? Well, I think we're all familiar with the fact that as you go up a mountain, the climate gets colder, and this is reflected in changing vegetation belts. And these vegetation belts are expressed differently on different sides of the mountains. So in the northern hemisphere, a south-facing mountain slope will tend to have a given species growing higher on the mountainside than on the north side of the mountain, simply because the rate at which temperature declines is lower that on the south side than it is the north side, because the south side gets all the sun. Well, we can quantify that in terms of numbers, and these numbers, this decrease in temperature with elevation, is called a thermal lapse rate. And there are a number of these different thermal lapse rates that have been used in the past to determine past surface height. There is, first of all, the free air or environmental lapse rate. And what this is, it's the temperature measured in a column of non-convecting free atmosphere. This is a kind of lapse rate that's used in aeronautics, for example, but it's not very useful for us when we're looking at proxies, geological proxies that form at the Earth's surface, like plant fossils or isotope in minerals and this kind of thing. Just for reference, the modern global average environmental lapse rate is 6.5 degrees C per kilometer. But as I said, what we really want to do is to measure the temperature decline at the Earth's surface where our proxies are formed. And this is called a terrestrial lapse rate. The modern terrestrial lapse rate is on average globally 5.5 degrees C per kilometer, which is less than the free air lapse rate. And this is because as we go up a mountainside, the exchanges of absorbing the heat from the sun, convection, evaporation, condensation, all these kinds of things tend to give rise to a lower lapse rate. In fact, this lapse rate can go negative, i.e. it gets colder as you go up. It gets warmer as you go up in intermontane basins, but that's another issue. Note also, going back to the original diagram I showed, that the lapse rate, the terrestrial lapse rate, is different depending on aspect. So using a global number is not very useful to us when we want to reconstruct elevations in the past. We often don't know what the aspect was in the past. We don't know which side of the mountain we were on, if it's in the deep time. So we have to be very careful about using global means. Now, we can use not just global means, we can use local ones, local thermal lapse rates, and we don't have to use even mean annual temperatures. We can use seasonal ones. And the seasonal ones might be useful if, for example, we're dealing with plant fossils that only grow in the summer. If it's a cool environment, most of the growth will be in the summer. The plants would be dormant in the winter. And so what's the point about using an annual mean under those circumstances? We also tend to measure temperatures using a dry bulb thermometer, a normal thermometer, if you like. And if we use these dry bulb thermometers, what we find is that we get an enormous scatter of, let's say, different reconstructions. Now, in 2021, Farnsworth et al. Decided to do and I was one of the authors, decided to do a climate modeling exercise where we gave the model a prescribed set of topographies and asked the model to reproduce these topographies using dry bulb terrestrial lapse rates. And what we found was that the annual means, shown here by the dark squares, were incredibly poor at reproducing the topography that we had introduced into the model. Now, in this kind of a diagram we have here, we have a reference, this red star. This is what we're aiming for. So the closer we are to this reference red star, i.e. what we gave to the model, the better our technique is. So you can see that using mean annual dry bulb lapse rates get nowhere near the red star. So they're hopeless at reproducing past landscapes. And if we use the summer or winter or autumn or spring, these different colored squares here, none of them get close to our star except the green ones over here. And these are springtime lapse rates, dry bulb lapse rates. But even they are pretty poor. What we decided to do was to look at this in a little bit more detail, and instead of using dry bulb lapse rates, we use wet bulb. Now, a wet bulb thermometer is one where there is a moist wick around the base of the thermometer, which is evaporating moisture to the air and so cooling the thermometer bulb. And under these circumstances, you get lower temperatures, and the drier the air is surrounding the thermometer, the more evaporation and the lower the temperature will be. Now, if we use wet bulb lapse rates, which are shown by these open squares here, it doesn't matter which season you are or whether you're using a mean annual, they all get very close to reproducing reality in the climate model. So if you want to use thermal lapse rates to reproduce past landscapes, you have to use a wet bulb thermometer, not a dry bulb. And this, without going into a lot of detail, is because as a parcel of air moves up a mountain slope, it's always got some moisture in it. And as it rises, it cools. As it cools, the humidity goes up. And as the moisture condenses, it gives off latent heat, which in turn affects the temperature. So temperature and humidity are intimately related in a parcel of air as it moves up and down over a land surface. Fortunately, we can use ancient leaf fossils to reproduce the wet bulb temperatures. And in fact, we can find, this shows a plot for wet bulb temperatures as derived from the CLAMP climate proxy. Here is the web address for the CLAMP climate proxy. I don't have a lot of time to go into this. It's just a multivariate statistical technique for translating leaf traits into ancient climate parameters. And amongst them is the wet bulb temperature. So if you want to know more, go to this website. But you can see from this regression, it's a pretty tight one with an R squared of 0.8. And the uncertainty, one standard deviation, is plus or minus 2.5 degrees Celsius. Now, we don't have to use leaves. We can use clumped isotopes. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically the degree to which C12 and oxygen-16 are substituted by C13 and oxygen-18 in a carbonate is temperature related. And the extent of this substitution of the heavier isotopes for the lighter isotopes is known as clumping. The amount of clumping is temperature dependent. So we can look at a carbonate, analyze its isotopic composition, and translate that into a surface temperature. Normally, the carbonates that we use are those that are formed in ancient soils or lakes, etc. We can also use, and we can translate those clumped isotope temperatures into wet bulb temperatures using a quite complicated equation that is used in a climate model. We can also use the trade-offs between temperature and humidity in terms of the conservation of energy. Now, when a parcel of air rises up a mountainside, its moist static energy, a combination of temperature and humidity, is conserved. It stays the same. And moist static energy is made up of a thing called moist enthalpy and potential energy, which is height times the gravitational constant. So what all this boils down to is that if you want to know a height difference, Z, what you need to do is measure the moist enthalpy at a low elevation, let's say sea level, and the moist enthalpy at a high elevation, and the difference between them divided by the acceleration due to gravity, which is a constant through time, gives you that height difference. And again, CLAMP, this leaf trait analysis, codes extremely well for moist enthalpy. So here is the correlation here, again, 0.8 R squared. So what this means is we can derive ancient moist enthalpy from fossil leaves. And lastly, in this paleoaltimetry section, we can also look at the degree to which isotopes get fractionated as they evaporate and condense, rising up through the atmosphere. Now, this is, if you like, an isotopic lapse rate. It's temperature dependent. And here is the relationship, or an example of a relationship from Rowley and Garzioni. And basically, as a parcel of air travels up a mountainside, the condensation that takes place in that parcel of air will preferentially be enriched with the heavy isotopes, oxygen 18, leaving the lighter isotopes, oxygen 16, in that parcel of air. So by the time the parcel of air crests the mountaintop, it will be enriched in the light isotope relative to the heavy isotope compared to when it started its journey at sea level. And this relationship can be used to interpret ancient climate, provided that those isotopes that are in the rainwater are converted to a mineral containing, like a carbonate, with the same ratio, and that mineral remains unaltered through time, so that when it's analyzed, we get a good idea of the ancient meteoric water isotopic composition. The problem with that approach is that when we have a central valley system like we have in, or we're hypothesizing for Tibet, with the Gangdesi to the south and the Changtang Mountains to the north, with a predominantly seasonally reversing airflow driven by the monsoon. In the summer, moist air rising against the southern flank of the Gangdesi is going to progressively become depleted in heavy isotopes. So the air that crests the mountains and enters the valley will be enriched with isotopes, the light isotopes, and the enrichment will be that which it inherited at the mountain crest. So all the isotopes ending up in the valley from the south will reflect the height of the Gangdesi. In the winter, we get the reverse process taking place, and this time moist air coming in from the continental interior. It's less moist than it is when it's derived from the ocean. And that too will be fractionated at the crest of the Changtang, so that the air going down into the valley on the other side will represent the isotopic composition of fractionation occurring at the crest of the Changtang. Well, what this means is that the isotopes that end up in something like a lake or a soil within the valley will reflect the height of the two crests. And so what you appear to get wherever you sample is a phantom plateau. And this phantom plateau is what led to the idea of a proto-Tibetan upland in the Eocene. If we test that using a climate model, here we've got Tibet with a valley in, here we've got a high flat Tibet. when we look at the isotope ratios that are predicted by the model to occur in the carbonates, there's no sign of the valley. They basically look almost the same. So we can't see the valley because it's not resolved by this process. Hence, we interpret our central Tibetan isotopic compositions as representing a highland, when actually all it represents is the height of the two mountain systems. So let's take a trip now to Tibet. This is what it looks like. And this is what some of the Eocene sediments that are deformed now because India is progressively moving northwards and buckling everything up. This is a locality in the Lumpula Basin, full of fossils. First of all, we're going to look at the Bangor Basin, which is next to the Lumpula, down here along the Bangong-Nujang-Sucha. This particular locality, known as the Jianglang locality, the Jianglang biota, comprises a number of different little quarries. Here's a car down here for scale. And we know the age of these is around Middle Eocene. There's UPB date there of 47 million years. And this is what we find. We find lots of these rabbit ear type seeds, look like a small dipterocarp. And we find similar things in Germany in the Messel deposits and in North America in the Green River, both Middle Eocene. So we're very confident about the age. But along with that, we've got other seeds, we've got flowers, we have plenty of leaves, etc. And when we look at the leaves and we apply clamp, what we get is a monsoon signature. The wet season was 6 times wetter than the dry season, which is a typical monsoon signature. The climate was subtropical with a mean annual temperature of around 19, with a cold month mean temperature of 7 plus or minus 3.5 degrees C. So the occasional frost was probably possible, but not enough to substantially cause problems to the vegetation. And it was humid. The vapor pressure deficit in the winter was 5.6, and the summer was 14.8. So it shows the summer was a lot drier as far as the plants were concerned than the winter. It's a winter wet regime, not a summer wet regime. And when we do our moist enthalpy paleoaltimetry, what we get is an elevation of 1.5 kilometers plus or minus 0.9. Now this contrasts with the 4.5 kilometers which are obtained using the isotope method, at least the fractionation isotope method. So we published a paper in PNAS last 2020, end of 2020, arguing for a Shangri-La type lost valley ecosystem in central Tibet, subtropical. Here's a little bit of summer rainfall, which challenges this high and dry concept that existed before in the Paleogene Tibet. So that was in the Bangor Basin. We're going to go next door and look at the Lumpula Basin. And what we find here are these things: very large palm leaves. Now we know today that the biology of palms means that natural populations cannot survive a cold month mean below 5.2 degrees Celsius. Particularly, this is limiting to seedlings. And when we look at the thermal lapse rates for this, using a climate model, and the age of 38 million years, which is different to the one we published on. We thought it was 25 when we published, but we now know from radiometric dating that it was 38. When we use the 38 date, we get an elevation of 2.8 kilometers as the maximum height that the palms could have survived. So the floor of the valley at 38 million years, slightly younger than we saw in the Bangor Basin, could not have been higher than 2.8 kilometers. Well, within the Lumpola, we also have a wonderful array of fossil leaves, including and seeds. And here is a seed of Ailanthus, which is one of the very few taxa which has affinities to India. Most of the taxa we find in Eocene central Tibet have relatives elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, but not India. There are a few like Ailanthus, but they're not common. Well, we can use clamp again on the woody dicot leaves, and what we then find is that at 38 million years, the elevation had risen from 1.5 kilometers to 2.6 kilometers. We also find in the Lumpola are water striders and these kind of fish, and this fish is a climbing perch, which is actually air breathing. And these fish cannot survive in lakes that freeze in the winter, where the surfaces freeze over. So we know that there cannot have been very cold temperatures, and this coincides beautifully with what the clamp temperatures are. Rare frost, but not enough to freeze a lake surface. The clumped isotopes that we can use from the Lumpola have to be interpreted with great care. Soil carbonates do not form all year, but only when the temperatures are relatively warm and the soil is drying, but not totally dry. This is because we have to have liquid in order to precipitate the carbonate from. Normally, it's assumed that soil carbonates represent summer temperatures, but if the summer is not particularly wet, or rather it is wet but not drying, or it is totally dry, you're not going to get soil carbonates forming in the summer. So what we did, we used a climate model with a Lutetian Tibetan Valley scenario here to examine what the drying regime was of the soil at the depth at which the soil carbonates form, or are sampled rather, which is 40 centimeters. So we find here that from April through to October, basically, or November actually, we have a drying of the soil at depth, driven by precipitation evaporation ratio, which is negative between February and June. And the rainfall was mostly concentrated in this scenario in this time of the year, in winter, or October through to January, and there is a small amount of summer rain. When we look at putting all of these together to see when is most likely that carbonates formed in the soils, we find that we have a window between March and July, which is this red box here, when the carbonates were most likely to have formed. And so we take our temperature for this part of the year as the temperature that the carbonates represent. We can do the same thing for for a number of different scenarios, topographic scenarios. Here we have a plateau in the Lutetian and slightly younger in the Chattian. We have a valley and a Chattian plateau. And when we look at the results that we get from our clumped isotopes, the clumped isotope scenario, formation scenario, and predicted elevations are only compatible with two possible situations. One where we have a Lutetian valley and one we have a Chattian plateau. So if we transform from a Lutetian valley, where the valley bottom is 1.7 kilometers, remember the plants told us 1.5 to 2.6, depending on where we were. 2.6 was at 38 million years, sorry. And we look at the Chattian valley, plateau scenario, we find that it's gone from 1.7 to 4 kilometers or thereabouts in this window here, slightly younger. So this paper that's just been published, again, I'm a co-author on this, shows that we have a transition from a valley to a plateau occurring by the early Oligocene. Putting an awful lot of data together, this is what we see for the Tibetan region. The Gangdesi have been there since the Mesozoic, basically the late Mesozoic. So we have a Gangdesi highland along the southern margin of Eurasia. We then form the Hengduan Mountains in eastern Tibet, again using a mixture of clamp analysis of leaves and various isotope studies. Then central Tibet rises in the late Eocene through to the early Oligocene. Northern Tibet rises somewhat later. Again, this is reflected both in leaf fossils and isotopes, but is not that dissimilar to the old Teponye idea of northern Tibet being relatively young. But the youngest, in contrast to Teponye et al., piece of this third pole are the Himalaya, which undergo a massive increase in height between 23 million years and 15 million years. And of course, they're still rising in places. So that's our overview based on all this paleoaltimetry. But are these numbers that we get from our different paleoaltimetric techniques reliable? So to test that, what we need is a relatively young depositional basin at elevation, significant elevation, where we have sea level data to match of the same age. So I'm choosing here the Zander Basin, or sometimes called the Zada Basin, which is a late Miocene to Pliocene basin in the northern Himalaya, northwestern Himalaya, at a present elevation average within the basin of around 4,250 meters. It's relatively well dated, a combination of paleontology and magnetostratigraphy. And we're going to be looking primarily at a leaf fossil assemblage here, which is dated around 3 to 3.5 million years ago. Now, a benefit of looking at this basin is that people have already done a lot of isotope paleoaltimetry and plant-based paleoaltimetry using pollen and leaves and different techniques. The leaf flora appears to be representative of semi-arid conditions. The leaves tend to be all quite small, much as the conditions are today. Here we've got a shrubland along the edge of the river within the basin. These are all the sediments that are being exposed by the river downcutting, and these are the ones that have the fossils in that we're looking at. It's an ancient lake slash fluvial system, and in the distance you can see I think these are the Himalaya, but they could be the Gangdesi. In either case, there's mountains just to the north and south. Well, what happens when we look at these? Well, first of all, let's look at the isotopes. Now, Saylor et al. 2019 used fractionation of oxygen isotopes to obtain an elevation which was between 5 and 6 kilometers high, shown in the light pink. An awful lot of assumptions went into this work, and it's very complicated to read through. And one of the main problems was that there was no good control for the temperature at which the carbonates formed that were used to determine, or that were analyzed for the fractionation. So Huntington et al. Then applied clumped isotopes to obtain that temperature and used temperature and lapse rates to come up with an elevation. And in 2015, Huntington et al. Came up with an elevation between something like 4.9 and 5.5 kilometers. And what they did was they did not measure their elevations relative to sea level, but relative to the existing basin. And the existing basin height, as I said, is just above 4 kilometers. So their uncertainties in doing this relative height change are small compared to what they would have done if they had tried to measure from sea level. Back in 2014, Wu et al. Looked at the pollen assemblage within the Zander Basin. And what they came up with was an elevation of below 3.6 kilometers in the Pliocene. And one thing that's very apparent from their pollen spectrum is that an awful lot of the pollen in there are wind pollinated taxa. So it's picea, pines, spruce, ulmus, betula. And there's none of that vegetation in the basin today, but there's plenty of it on the southern flank of the Himalaya at low elevations. And what I suspect is happening here is that the prevailing summer winds, spring and summer winds, are lofting the pollen up and over the Himalaya and dumping it in the basin. And so all these heights represent are the heights at which the taxa, various taxa, are growing on the southern flank of the Himalaya, not the basin itself. But we can apply a leaf assemblage, or look at a leaf assemblage that Huang et al. Published on in 2020. Now they use CLAMP and a very complicated way of translating both CLAMP and nearest living relative approaches into elevations, and their elevation range was very similar to the present basin, around 3.5 to 4.2 kilometers, which is shown here in the light blue band. But what Huang et al. Did was they didn't use moist enthalpy, but they did publish their scoring regime for the leaf fossils. So we were able to take the leaf fossils and use the more modern calibration, Physic Asia 2 with World CLIM calibration. And when we use moist enthalpy, we get elevation predictions here. And these are for various Siwalik localities near sea level along the length of the Siwalik front. We get these elevations. They vary depending on which fossil assemblage you use in the Siwalik. And here, but basically, they all fall within the isotope elevation band of Saylor et al. Or Huntington et al. What we can also do is look at dry bulb, global mean annual dry bulb lapse rates. The global mean lapse rate then applied to a mean annual temperature derived from CLAMP from the Huang et al. Assemblage, and we get very low elevations coming from this. And remember that global mean lapse rates are not appropriate for specific sites because terrestrial lapse rates are so variable in space and time. What we can also do is use a model wet bulb lapse rate, but a dry bulb MAT recovered from our assemblage, and again we get low elevations and so on. When we use wet bulb mean annual temperatures and wet bulb lapse rates derived from climate modeling, we actually get very similar results to Huang et al. So the question is, which of these is correct? Well, a paper by Zhu et al. In 2021 noted that the Zander Basin is a pull-apart basin, and that because it's extensional, we cannot really argue for the Zander Basin being lower in the Pliocene. And basically Saylor and Huntington are arguing for a drop in elevation of around about 1 kilometer in the last 3 million years. So Zhu et al. Were quite fond of this elevation as being a real one because it's not unreasonable to get a drop in elevation in an extensional basin. But what we can do is discount all of these approaches. The dry bulb and the palynology in this context gives very, very erroneous and unlikely outcomes. The wet bulb lapse rates and the moist enthalpy give two somewhat similar elevations, but the moist enthalpy is giving a high one, very similar to the isotopes. When we look at moist enthalpy patterns globally, moist enthalpy reflects topography extremely well. So here we've got two global maps. One has got a Tibet with a valley in, and one's got a plateau in it. And when you look at moist enthalpy at elevation minus moist enthalpy at sea level, you reproduce this, the topography in the model extremely well. So we know in principle enthalpy works in terms of detecting the model topography. What I did, and I'm almost at the end now, is I did a desk exercise during lockdown, during COVID lockdown, very frustrated and not being able to get into the field. And I took a number of locations along the Siwalik front, typical of the kind of fossil localities that we have. And I drew on Google Maps a north-south transects up to a height in the order of 5 kilometers in the Himalaya. And using gridded climate, looked at the moist enthalpy at the starting point and the moist enthalpy at elevation for each one of these sites, divided those moist enthalpies by the acceleration due to gravity, and theoretically that should return to me the observed elevation as represented in Google Earth. Well, this is what we found. The observed is shown in blue all the way along here, but the estimated using the moist enthalpy approach systematically overestimated the height difference along those transects. This is very sobering because it means that enthalpy may in fact be overestimating ancient surface heights. And remember, I said earlier, the isotopes will inherit an isotopic signature, not of the basin in which the carrier minerals are formed, but a signature that reflects the elevation of the mountain ridges or crests that the parcel of air passed over before entering the depositional site. So it is likely that the Huntington, Salar, and enthalpy methods all overestimate the height of the Zander Basin in the Pliocene by approximately 1 kilometer in all cases. One very last point to the future. Mount Shishapangma is quite famous in terms of the story of the uplift of the Tibetan region, the third pole region, because back in 1973, Zhu et al. Described some Quercus semicarpifolia leaves above 5,000 meters on the 8,000 meter Mount Shishapangma. And this is Mount Shishapangma from the Tibetan plateau looking south towards India. Sutao and colleagues at XTBG last year went back to Mount Shishapangma to try and find this locality because the locality had been lost and there were no secure dates. The fossils were thought to be Pliocene because this is a modern taxon. What they found was at just below 6,000 meters, a fossil oak leaf. And they found it in a location where that they can date. And literally the other day, I got the first indications of the oldest possible date for this is 16 million. So it could be mid-Miocene or younger, but we don't yet know precisely how young. But this is all very exciting stuff, and it could tell us more about the elevation of the Himalaya. So here are some takeaway thoughts. Plant fossils, isotopes, and climate modeling are changing our ideas of the Tibetan landscape evolution. And this evolution was very complex, revealing deep geological processes, which include thermal delamination, but not uniformly across the whole plateau. This complexity with a Paleogene Central Valley has got to be incorporated to any climate modeling that we do, and climate modeling and proxies have got to be looked at iteratively to try and improve both and our understanding of past landscapes. So this iteration is pretty fundamental if we want to try and understand monsoon dynamics through time. That, as they say, is another story. and it's becoming quite clear that monsoon evolution is not just a simple story of the sudden appearance of the South Asian monsoon or the East Asian monsoon. The monsoons developed organically, as it were, over time. Isotope and fossil-based paleoaltimetric proxies are complementary. Isotopes tend to give you information on the highs and fossils on the lows. Isotope fractionation proxies are biased towards these mountain crest heights, but they can also give phantom plateau in complex terrains that include valley systems. And fossil pollen paleoaltimetric proxies are highly problematic. Pollen can be transported over long distances, upslope, downslope, and all over the place. I would not touch pollen as an indicator of ancient surface heights. But fossil leaf proxies using moist enthalpy or wet bulb approaches do offer promise, but we have to remember that they are biased towards lowlands. So if you use those proxies and isotopes together, you get some idea of ancient relief. And finally, a thank you for from all our team for listening, and also from our Tibetan friends, without whom we could not have done the field work. Thank you very much. Ritesh, you're muted.
Thank you, Robert Spicer. It was a very, very interesting talk. You took us right from the Himalayas to the Tibetan Plateau and explained the various geodynamics of the Tibetan Plateau using the plant fossils. I must say it was an eye-opener to all of us, and the way you explained the use of plant fossils in defining the various altitudes of the Himalayas in different phases in the Tibetan Plateau. It was really very interesting. I would just like to mention here that you said that the shivalic fossils and now I don't remember the Lapula and the Bangor Basin.
And Bangor basins.
And the Bangor Basin, yeah.
Yeah.
So you said that there is some similarity.
They are similar in terms of some species, but maybe this message got slightly mangled.
Okay.
There are relatively few taxa which are common to India and to Central Tibet. Ailanthus is one. There are a few others. But generally speaking, the fossils that we find in Central Tibet are more similar to the fossils we find as far away as North America and Germany than in India.
Yeah.
Now, even though Central Tibet was relatively low, only 1.5 kilometers above sea level, and at that time, India, although India was further south, or bulk of India was further south in the Eocene, it wasn't that far above sea level. So we're not talking about huge latitudinal differences, and we're not talking about huge altitudinal differences. So you would expect some taxonomic similarity. But what seems to be happening is that the Gangdesi, which form this mountain chain along the southern flank of Eurasia, was a fairly effective barrier to taxa coming in from India into Central Tibet. It was easier for taxonomic exchange to go sideways than it was to go north-south.
I think these are very, very interesting results which you have found, because always you remember that you visited Kasauli long back in early 90s. So
when I was younger than I am now, yes.
Yeah. So I was able to do that, some of the leaf studies, and then these leaves, Garcinia gluta, Combretum caesium, and some palms, beautiful preserved palms. And these palms now from Kasauli Formation also, which are presently at an altitude of about 2,000 meters above mean sea level. And we found some very interesting palm fossils in Ladakh also,
Mhm.
and some very interesting fossils from Kargil also.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some we were working in Neoma. This is in Chanthang area. So there we found some very good collection of bivalves, pelecypods, and gastropods. So all these oysters, and these were quite similar to the ones which we find in the Subathu Sea Eocene sequence.
Mhm.
So interesting results coming up, and then these were on the southern side of Indus River, and then we have the Ladakh batholith. So nothing can these Ladakh batholiths are about 6,000 meters plus,
Right.
elevation wise, and the southern part of the Indus River, we get very good, interesting sections. So these fossils which we are finding in Kasauli, when we in 1994 when we published this, and at that time I was just quite very young, and then we were doing collaborative work with Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleobotany, and then it was just an inference, like these fossils are not found in Himalayas now,
Mm.
and they have affinities with Andaman Nicobar, with Malaysia or Indonesian fossils,
Yeah. Yeah.
at that time. And present Texa is also like, so what, then we published this, and then this was part of my PhD thesis also. And then subsequently what happened was I just moved on and worked in Ladakh for so many years, and then we found a lot of fossils there also, tree trunks about 20 feet, and then in Kasauli also we have about 90 feet long tree trunks now we have
Yeah.
found now.
Yeah.
So they are huge tree trunks here, and so all these leaves and the entire things in Ladakh and in Kasauli, we were able to just find a lot of, in Kargil, we were able to find a lot of similarity in fossils, and then almost thought that they were almost of same basin. And then the paleolatitudinal position of Kasauli at that time, at the time of deposition, was about near the equator, about maybe 4 degrees to 9 degrees, or maybe 11 degrees
Mhm.
at the time of formation of these fossils, based on this correlation, So
Mm.
interesting thing is around 20 million years, if we say Kasauli formation is about 20 million years based on the charophytes which we found and some dating which was done by. So this 20 million years, if it is near Kasauli, then 16 last slide the second last slide or third last which you showed is from I again forgot the name, which place you showed was about 16
Well,
million years,
Shishipangma.
Shishipangma, yeah. So this is quite interesting, So 16 million years we are getting in Shishipangma, and then Kasauli about 20 million years. Yeah, this one, this is quite
Yeah.
interesting now. So this fossil, if they are finding it at that elevation, and then we have a lot of 20 million years time frame near the equator, India, very much near the India's not equator, but the Indian peninsula, maybe further south, and then this entire landmass must be the basin was existing there, and I now firmly believe that then India was just colliding with this basin, which was near the equator, already existing because of the fossils, and then after this, then there was some, like you showed that the Tibetan plateau around very young ages, you showed that they were just elevating at that time from 1.5 kilometers to about 4 point something 7 kilometers.
Yeah.
This is quite
Late Eocene into by early Oligocene, we're up above 4 kilometers.
4 kilometers. So maybe if we get some more data on that aspect, and then we just relate the movement of, because if for 20 million years Indian peninsula was there, and then we have a basin where Kasauli, Sabathu, Dagshai, and things were happening independently of
Yeah.
what India was there, and then
One.
India pushed this entire sequence further due to its movement, and then the position of Kasauli, which we are finding today, or maybe Ladakh also, which we are finding today, was very near to the equator, extending maybe
Yeah.
towards Arabia or maybe Oman or something like that. The basin was extending, right, and it was continuing in that maybe. So this is quite interesting, and they maybe I'll just so these two basins at that time, till that time, were independently developing, and the plant flora and fauna, maybe the angiosperms proliferation in Eocene, if it was there, and then we are not finding much Eocene fossils in the Himalayas in Indian side, but maybe in Gujarat, Kutch Basin, we are finding some good fossils of plants, but not in the Himalayan part. But yes,
Yeah.
there are some pollen grains or something reported here. But recently, we found a carbonized wood with oyster bands. The Eocene bands. The first, maybe the this organic remains. So maybe this and your findings in, because the way you had shown your first few slides this transgression, which was actually taking place from Cretaceous or Jurassic, and then subsequently further north, and almost becoming in the very recent now. So these elevations, and the stratigraphic sequence, and what was happening in in this side, are very independent, and maybe
I
this joint at, sorry, just complete, and this joint at Ladakh batholith forms a great barrier, to delineate things which were happening south of Ladakh batholith, and maybe north of Ladakh batholith, and then this becomes, what are your takes on this now? Yeah.
Right. The whole western end of the Himalaya appears to be somewhat different in terms of its elevational history to the eastern end. We know that around, let me see, what is it now? Well, the end of the Oligocene, very early Miocene, parts of the eastern Siwalik are definitely at sea level because we get mangrove remains and this kind of stuff. The age of the initial collision is something that is also completely, well, it's argued about endlessly. A very recent paper last year, or was it earlier this year? I think it was Anne et al. Dated the deposition of Eurasian sediments on Indian continental but submarine deposits at 61 million. So you're getting shedding from Eurasia onto marine sediments that are actually overlying Indian continental crust at 61. So very soon after 61, you're likely to have continent-continent collision expressed by the diminishing or loss of ocean. So one of the problems with the climate models is, what was the water source for isotopes between India and Eurasia? In other words, when did we lose that oceanic water source immediately south of the Himalaya? Critical question, okay? But quite different from when subduction begins, because we can still have a moat there. Now, I know that a lot of people have said, well, mid-Eocene, but actually, if we're getting the sort of results that Anne et al. Are showing, it could be a lot earlier. It could be Paleocene. The second thing is, what is the role of the Kohistan-Ladakh arc in all of this? This is the idea that there is an arc system at the western end of what is now the Himalaya, and going into the Karakorums, that this arc system was entrained or trapped between India and Eurasia, but also that this arc system acted as a biotic stepping stone system for biotic exchange between India and Africa. Not so much Asia, because southern Asia was a desert at that time. In fact, the desert conditions persist until, this is really, really recent research, in fact, submitted yesterday. We're looking again at middle part of the Eocene. So there are big changes taking place in the Eocene in this region. Absolutely crucial to understand, and because the fossil record is not complete, is doing the climate and vegetation modeling that goes along with the data sets that we do, the proxy data sets we do have. Until we know where India was and where the water sources were for the isotopes, when was the last decent water source, the Neo Tethys, north of India, south of Eurasia, when did that disappear? Absolutely crucial. And I think a lot of the answers are to be found in the Western Himalaya. You must be aware that some people argue that India first impacted Eurasia in the northwest of India, what is now northwest of India, and other people argue, no, it was the northeast of India. I mean, basically, nobody knows. So at the moment, we probably know more about the eastern end of the Himalaya through the work that's been done in Assam, Siwaliks, some extent Nepal, but relatively little work's been done in the West. And as you know, the West today is a lot drier than the East along the Himalayan front. And that this drying appears to be relatively recent, although we'd like to know an awful lot more about it. When you go into Gujarat and Rajasthan, you find early Eocene tropical forests as fossils. You find similar fossils, although not that old, over in the East. And it seems the East remains tropical and wet a lot longer than the West does. All of these changes are absolutely crucial to understand in detail. And at the moment, we just, we need more work done. We need more research. And you are extremely well placed to do that.
Yeah, we are trying to do, but we need a lot of collaborations, I have a lot of fossils, maybe hundreds of leaves I have. And recently we found very good organic woods about, as I told you, about 30 meters long. And so now work needs to be done here. Yeah. And then probably BSIP may be interested in doing all these things. And then we are collaborating. Maybe in near future things will come up in a better way. But again, I would just like to ask you one interesting question: is from the plant fossils, like Wegener started this plate tectonics theory based on fossils of plants, Glossopteris or Gangopteris, and then with these fossils, which we find in, because I remember when you came, we were able to find this Garcinia. If I showed you, it was long back, and then
it was a long time ago. I don't remember, but yes, if you say so.
It was 19, early, I think 89, 90 you visited, or maybe.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So those fossils leaves, again, my question is, based on those fossil leaves, can we actually are trying to make a model that these fossils make Kasauli, which are approximately at a present day latitude is about 28 degrees and north of equator, and then we want to take it back to about 4 to 11 degrees or maybe that position. So that study needs to be done, and how we can make a model actually, because these plant fossils are there and then they don't lie, the leaves don't lie.
No, exactly.
Lie, and then we have these, and then we need an explanation that they are not found here and they are found in the Andaman, and that question is intriguing me. Yeah. And now you say that most of the plant fossils of Tibetan, the Lhasa and the Tibet, are not having any affinities with the Indian part, but they have affinities with American, German, or North American parts. So that is very interesting. That should be there. and Chitravata formation in Pakistan, and the fossils which you are getting in, we are getting in Kasauli, and then what we are getting in Indonesia, they are almost showing equatorial positions,
Yeah.
or very marine. So
As I
this
say,
is, yeah,
we
yeah.
really do need to know more about the role of the Khoistan arc. We need to know what the latitudinal position is. That paper I mentioned by Anne et al. Raised the question of, have we got all the paleomagnetic data wrong?
Yeah,
Because
because plant fossils you will not rely. The question is the 20 million years we are getting these fossils from Kasauli, and they have, and Chitravata formation almost of the same age, the Upper Murray formation in Chitravata, Pakistan. They almost, and also in Assam, the Garo Khasi hills, these fossils almost show very significant coastal marine sequence, and and all these show the Kasauli formation. As I told you, they show very close affinities with. So there was a gap, this about six from 11 degrees north of equator, and traveling to 28 degrees present location needs an explanation,
yeah.
And if we
What
if
you,
if we join, if we believed in the data of the paleomagnetic, then probably the collision is already had taken place around 60 million years back, or 40 million years back, or even 13 million years. But how will you explain the occurrence of fossils of the Kasaulis, which are very near to the equator at that time?
yeah.
So that is my simple.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned BSIP. I assume you're in contact with people there, but also Mahsin Ali Khan. He was with Subir Bera in Calcutta. He's now another university. I published with him quite a lot on the Eastern Siwaliks. I know that he has an interest in the Western Siwaliks, as indeed do BSIP people. So that there is interest in India in doing this. And what I found is that most of what I regard the most important aspects of my research have always been done in collaboration with other people.
Yeah.
Bringing together different experiences, different skill sets, etc. So I would really encourage you to develop good relations with BSIP and with Mahsin, and work together on this. I know this from Chinese setting. A lot of people are very competitive, especially in the early stages of their career. But as you get older, the competitive necessity wanes, and your ability to collaborate increases. And basically, the sooner you start collaborating, the better the papers, the better the research, and the better your own personal, as it were, research presence becomes.
Thank you.
So long gone are the days when scientists worked individually.
Isolation, yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Because we require a lot of information from all the other inputs. Getting just fossils, yes, it is. Identification is done now. What next? The modeling.
Yeah. You need
And then we need a lot of data,
good dating.
Yeah.
You need good dating, preferably radiometric, where you can't get radiometric on a particular locality. You try and correlate with one that has got an absolute age on it, and so on and so on. So dating is crucial. Correct identification of the fossils is crucial. And as I said, the fossil data are never complete. The proxy data are never complete. The only way you can really make sense of them, when there's so many different parts of the Earth system interacting with one another, is when you're using numerical climate models. And if you can find a tame group of numerical modelers who can understand geology and can explain their mathematics to a mere botanist, if you like me, then it's a good collaboration.
Yeah, I think we should work on that. And last question: what according to you is the time when Tethys actually squeezed?
Disappeared.
Yeah, maybe you can say disappeared or maybe squeezed gradually or
I
whatever. Yeah.
I think that there are marine embayments, etc., lasting quite a long time into maybe 55 million, something like that. But in terms of a land contact and a diminishing of the Neotethys between India and Eurasia, that probably occurred quite early. So I would argue for around 60 to the very high 50s for a good solid land contact. And then over the next 5 million years, you basically drain the puddles, and then then you're stuck. then you start building the Himalaya, and by let's see, what was it, 56 million, you're there at 1 kilometer, according to the paper we published in Geology. And then at 23 million, they're at just over 2 kilometers. But by 19 million, they are nearly, well, they're above 4. So there's a big rise in the central Himalaya. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm very anxious to point out that that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole of the Himalaya all reach the same elevation at the same time, particularly if there's this differential contact going on. But which way around it is, I'm not convinced yet that we know the answer. We don't know whether the East built first or the West. I'm inclined to think the East and Central built first and the West was later, or the West is still going on, put it that way, significantly. But I could be wrong.
Okay. And another question which came into my mind: the fossil which the gentleman is showing of plant fossil.
Which one? This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is about, you said about 16 million years.
Well, we've got the first date in, and the oldest it can be is 16. So it's younger than 16. That's all we can say at the moment. So we don't know. We don't know the exact date yet. You've frozen. Ritesh, you're frozen.